right? So when we are completing the square, the main rule we have to remember is that the A value has to be what? What did you guys look up on that form? You guys remember your A value? Did you find what it said it had to be? Yep, your A value has to be 1. So same thing for today. Okay, but we are going to be working with some equations where the A value does not start out being 1. Okay, so you have to have that. So we're going to talk about how we can manipulate some of these so we do have that. So when you are completing the square for part A, you have 2x squared plus 7x minus 4 equals 0. Okay, and then your first step is going to be to divide by that A value. All right, so we're going to divide by our A. So if we divide everything by 2, then we have x squared plus 7 over 2x minus 2 equals 0. All right. Now we're going to keep all of our x terms on one side. We're going to move the non-x term over. I want you guys to think about what the formula is for filling in those blank spaces. Yep, half of b squared. So normally what we do is we divide by 2. Whenever you have a fraction, though, it's a lot nicer to think of it as multiplication. So if you cut something in half, that is the same thing as multiplying it by a half, right? Whether I take 8 and divide it by 2, or if I multiply 1/2 times 8, both cases I'm going to get 4. Okay, so if you have a fraction, it's a lot easier to think of this as multiplication. So that's what we're going to do whenever we have a non-integer here. Okay, so this is your b value. So we're going to do 7 over 2 times 1/2, and then we're going to square it. Okay, so if you guys remember from last week, I like to keep it like this. You guys might remember why. Okay, so 7 times 1 is 7, 2 times 2 is 4, and then when you square it, do you have to square the top and the bottom or just the top? Both. Yep, so because it's really, you're multiplying this, right? 7 fours times 7 fours, 7 times 7, 49, 4 times 4, 16. And the reason why I like to leave it like this is so that you can drop this down when you factor. Okay, I'm going to give you a minute to practice your fraction skills because those are going to be important in this unit. Okay, so add those together. So just remember we're doing this without our calculator. So when you're thinking about adding a whole number to a fraction, if you can get a common denominator, then you can just add those two numerators together, right? Okay, so if you have 2, it's 2 over 1 times 16 times 16, 2 times 16, 32. You add that to 49 over 16. Okay, how did that go? And then if you want, you can just add the 49 and the 30 first. It's 79. 79 plus 2, 81. That's nice. Why is that nice? It's a perfect square. So when you take the square root, you have the plus or minus, and then keep in mind this is the square root of the numerator over the square root of the denominator. Okay, so once you do your square roots, you have plus or minus 9 over 4, and then when you subtract this, you have two different answers. You have 9/4 minus 7/4, and you have negative 9/4 minus 7/4. Okay, I want you to write your two final answers so that they're simplified. And I know some of you guys are at different places, so once you finish A, you can start on part B. And I want you to double check if you have it in the All right, so if you have 2/4, what does that reduce to? 1/2. Negative 16 over 4, negative 4. So your final answer is x equals 1/2 or negative 4. Okay, if you haven't started part 2 yet, let's do that now. If you need some help starting, again, make sure that you're writing down these directions. You're using division to make your A value 1, so that should be your first step. If it is not a whole number, you are going to keep it as a fraction. your first step is dividing by 2. When you divide by 2, you divide everything by 2. Okay, so that gives you x squared minus 3 over 2x plus 5 over 2 equals 0. The x terms are going to stay. The 5 halves gets moved over. And then when you are filling in those blank spaces, because it's a fraction, we're going to take the b value, multiply it by 1/2, and that's how we're going to fill this in. So negative 3/4 squared. When you're squaring this, you are multiplying this by itself. So negative 3 times negative 3 is 9. 4 times 4 is 16. On this side, we know we're going to factor. Okay, on this side, if you have not gotten your common denominator, I want you to do that now. Okay, so we're going to be working a lot with fractions. We want to make sure we know how to multiply, divide, square, add, subtract. Okay, and if you are having trouble getting a common denominator, I always like to ask myself, what do I multiply by 2 to get to 16? So I multiply by 8, so that's what I have to do to the top. Okay, so it's a negative 40 over 16, and then remember that this is your plus. I kind of covered it up with my work there. Okay, so negative 40 plus 9 is negative 31. I know that probably feels a little weird, but that is correct for this. And then we're going to take the square root to undo the power of 2. Once you take that square root, don't forget your plus or minus. You can think of this as the square root of negative 31 over the square root of 16. The square root of 16 is a perfect square. Okay, this one is not, and we have a negative. So what do I have to bring in? I. There's 2 ways you can write this. Okay, sometimes people write the I in front. It's usually so that they don't accidentally put it underneath the square root. Okay, and then you are going to add over the 3/4. Okay, so you can write this as 3/4 plus or minus I root 31 over 4. Or you can put the I on the side, which is what I would think most of you would do, which is 3/4 plus or minus root 31 over 4, and then just put the I in the center. Okay, so either one of those forms are fine. Okay, just make sure you don't put the I underneath the radical there. All right, so that's a continuation of what we did last week. And then this next thing we're going to do, we are also going to be using completing the square techniques to write quadratic equations in vertex form. Okay, so vertex form should be familiar to you. It's f of x equals a times the quantity x minus h squared plus k. We saw that in chapter 1 when we had to write equations based on a graph. Remember that in this form, the vertex is hk. So h is the x coordinate, k is the y coordinate. Okay, and then your axis of symmetry always goes through the x coordinate of the vertex. So the axis of symmetry is going to be x equals h. Whatever your value is for h, that is going to be your axis of symmetry. Okay, and then you're also going to have to identify the maximum or minimum. That is always based on your A value. So we talked about on our last unit that if A was positive, our graph would open up and that would create a minimum value. And if A was negative, then the parabola would open downward and that would create a maximum value. Okay, so you are going to have to identify whether or not there is a maximum or a minimum. So if A is positive, it opens up, there's a min. If A is negative, it opens downward, there's a maximum. Now let's look at these directions here. They're kind of intense. You have to find a few different things. The first thing it says is write each function in vertex form. When you have to do this on your assessment, you are going to have to use the completing the square technique. So we're going to use completing the square. Okay, you are going to find the axis of symmetry. That's the second thing. You are going to find the vertex. And then you are going to say whether or not that is a max or a min. Okay, so there's 4 different parts to your answer here. Okay, and this is almost the same thing as completing the square. There's one difference, okay? So when you are completing the square, we always take the x terms and we want to group them together. When we were doing this before, we'd move the other thing, the other number to the other side of the equation. For this, we're going to keep it on one side. And we're just going to add our blanks on the same side. So it's x squared plus 16x plus blank minus 12 plus blank. And we're going to keep this as f of x. Okay, the reason why we're going to keep this is if it's in vertex form, you have your f of x. It's going to be an equation. And because you're working with one side of the equation, instead of adding something to one side and to the other side, we have to make sure whatever we add to one side is equal to 0. So we're still going to use b over 2 squared. Okay, so if I take half of b, which is 8, and square it, I get 64. What you're doing here is you're adding 64. So if you're adding 64, you have to subtract 64 to balance the equation. These have to be opposites. I'll go over it. I'll give you guys a chance to write it down. All right, so you're still using b over 2 squared. So 8 squared. Okay, so what you did on this side is you added 64. Because you're working on the same side of the equation, okay, you have to think of this as a scale. So before, we were adding 64 to one side, 64 to the other. Everything was balanced. Now, both of our blanks are on the same side. So if I add 64, I have to subtract it so that it's 0 because I don't have anything over here. Okay, for here, if I subtracted 64 to both sides, I'd have 0. Here I have 0. That's what we're trying to make. Okay, so if this is a positive, this is going to be a negative. And then the rest is going to be the same. You're going to factor. You're going to combine your like terms. Negative 12 and negative 64 is going to be negative 76. This is your equation. Okay, based on your equation, I want you to see if you can take out the vertex. Okay, what's your H? What's your K? Write down what you guys think your vertex is. Okay, if you're feeling unsure about the vertex, I want you to take a look up here. So your vertex is your H and K, and then let's look at the equation. So in the equation, you have this negative sign. Here it's a positive. There's no sign in front of it. This means you do the opposite. So if you have positive 8 here, your vertex is a negative 8. K, it's a positive here and a positive here. So if it's a negative 76, it's going to say negative 76. Okay, so that is going to be your vertex. Another thing you can do to check this, if you are unsure, something we have done earlier is find the x-coordinate of the vertex using the opposite of b over 2a. We've done that this year. So if you wanted to double check, if you weren't sure, you could do the opposite of b over 2a using the original equation. And isn't your answer negative? Yeah. Okay, so it should be the same. You guys remember the opposite of b over 2a? That's how we found the x-coordinate of the vertex. We put it in the middle of the table, and then we plugged it in to find y. You could still plug that in, and that would be this value. Okay, now the axis of symmetry, you have to make sure that you put x equals with it. You can just abbreviate it. You can abbreviate it AOS. Okay, and then it's x equals your x-coordinate. Okay, and then your a value is going to be 1. So if your a value is 1, it opens upward, and that means you have a minimum. Okay, so then this is going to include all of your solutions. Okay, your a value is 1. If it's positive, we know it opens up and creates a min. Okay, I would also just write a little note to yourself to remember that axis of symmetry is a line. Okay, so the axis of symmetry is always going to have x equals. Okay, so you always need that. Axis of symmetry is a line, so you got to have your x equals there. All right, go ahead and give B a try, please. All right, so let's see how we did. All right, so if you have negative 24, whatever the sign is of this, when you factor it, that sign is going to stay. So you added 144 here, which means you have to subtract it there. These two are always going to be opposites. They should always add to 0 because you're adding them to the same side. And then when you are writing your equation, just make sure you have that f of x equals there. Your vertex is going to be the opposite of what's inside, and then the outside will stay the same. Make sure you get that x equals on your axis of symmetry. And then is this a minimum or a maximum? So what's your a value? 1. So if it's positive, it opens up, and that creates a minimum. All right, great. Now, just like we saw today with some of the completing the squares, the value in front of x squared isn't always 1, but we can manipulate the equation so that we can use completing the square. So if your coefficient is not 1, then what we're going to do is we are going to factor the coefficient out. And when it says we're going to factor the coefficient, they mean your a value, your leading coefficient. Okay, so you're going to factor out your a value, and you're going to factor that out of the first 2 terms. Okay, so you're going to factor that out of the first 2 terms. Now, we are also going to be using the distributive property to fill in the blanks, and I'm going to help you with that. Okay, so let's start the first one together. So we're going to group the x terms together, and we're going to factor out the a value. So in this case, your a value is 3. So if you factor that out, you're going to divide by 3. 3x squared divided by 3 is x squared. Negative 18 divided by 3 is negative 6. I'm going to keep the x with it. And that is those are the only 2 that you're going to factor the a value out of. Okay, now we're going to complete the square for the x values. And really, you could do this in that step. I just want to show you what that looks like. Okay, and then the blank is going to be the same as before. So half of negative 6 is negative 3, and then you square it. There's just one thing that's going to be different here. When you took out this 3, okay, and you put it outside the parentheses, we know that the distributive property applies here. 3 times x squared is 3x squared. 3 times negative 6x is negative 18x. So when I'm adding this a 9 here, I know that this 3 has to be applied. So I have to distribute the 3. And if you want, you can put the parentheses or the times, whatever is going to help you remember that you have to distribute. So really, you didn't add 9, you added 27. That is the quantity because of this 3 on the outside. Okay, so once you distribute, you can see what you've added, and that's what you have to take away. So again, these 2 values have to be the opposite. They have to add to 0. And if you have an a value that's not 1, it's just going to stay on the outside here. So the 3 stays on the outside. When you factor, you have x minus 3 squared. 7 plus a negative 27 is negative 20. And the vertex, axis of symmetry, min or max rules all stay the same. Okay, so your vertex is still just the opposite of what you see inside. Your axis of symmetry is x equals this value. And then because your A value is positive, it's still opening upward, which creates a minimum. Okay, so a small change there with the distribution. Okay, and then I want you to try the first two steps for part B. You can keep going if you're feeling good. But at the very least, I want you to be able to factor out that A value and then fill in that first blank space. So factor out the A. Okay, so when you divide by -1, what does that do to the middle value? Yep. So if you group these together, if you take out that negative, you can either put negative on the outside or -1. Okay, 8 divided by -1 is -8. So if you need to make an adjustment, make an adjustment. I always like to distribute to double check. Negative times x squared is negative x squared. Negative times negative x is how I get positive x. And then from there, if I take half of -8, I get -4 squared. So I know -4 squared is 16, but I also have to distribute this negative. So I didn't really add 16, I added -16. Because a negative times 16 is -16, which means I'm adding a positive 16 here. So if it's a negative on the outside, you're going to end up adding. If it's a positive on the outside, you're going to end up subtracting. Okay, and then let's see if you can factor and then find the vertex, axis of symmetry, and whether it's a maximum or a minimum. All right, so then you have x minus 4 squared plus 33. This is your f of x. Okay, and then your vertex, 433. Axis of symmetry is always equal to that x coordinate. Okay, now this time it was a negative, so it opened downward, which means you have a maximum. All right, we ready for the grand finale here? All right, and sometimes they're going to say f of x, sometimes they might say y. So let's do y equals negative 2x squared we'll do another negative. All right. First things first, let's group those x's together. Okay, now with all the ones we had before, they were divisible by this number. So -2 is what we have to factor out. Okay, now I want you to think about this. When we divided by 3 up here, right? We did 3x squared divided by 3, -18 divided by 3. This is no different. -2x squared divided by -2 is x squared. Okay, -5x divided by -2. A negative divided by a negative is a positive, so it's going to be positive 5 over 2x. Okay, plus blank -5 plus blank. Okay, you did this earlier today. You had a fraction here, and when we cut it in half to make it easier, what did we end up doing? Multiplying by 1/2. So I want you to fill in the blank spaces. Okay, multiply by 1/2. All right, so when you multiply by a half, 5 over 2 times 1/2 is 5/4. All right, and then once you have this squared, 25 over 16, we're just going to distribute this, okay? So -2 times 25 over 16. Okay, so multiply those together, fill in that other blank. This is a really good one to practice your fractions. Okay, don't just wait for me to write it down. Okay, so when you're multiplying a whole number by a fraction, just keep in mind that this whole number is over 1. So you have -50 over 16. So if you're subtracting 50/16, that means here we're adding 50/16. Okay, so I have -2x plus 5/4 squared. Okay, and then when I'm adding these two together, it's -5/1. So I have to make that times 16 times 16. Okay, it might be easier for some of you if you don't have a calculator to do 5 times 10 and then 5 times 6. Because what's 5 times 10? 50. What's 5 times 6? 30. So this is going to be -80/16 plus 50/16. And that's going to be, yep, -30/16. And then what can I do to that? You got to reduce it, right? What goes into both? 2. Divide by 2, divide by 2. So -15/8. There we go. Okay, and then again, if you want to double check this using the opposite of b over 2a, 5, right, over 2 times -2 is -5/4. That's going to be your vertex. -5/4, -15/8. Yep, so opposite here, that's going to be the same. X is going to be equal to the x coordinate of your vertex. And then if it's negative, it opens downward. Does that give us a maximum or a minimum? Maximum. Okay, so this is going to create your max because your a value is negative. Okay. All right, and then I'll put some problems up so you can get started. It's 34 through 40 evens, and then 44 through 49 all. Okay, so the first set is just the evens.
Too many questions. Oh, yeah.